All right, welcome back from lunch, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We've got the next hour and 10 minutes with our keynote. As we're figuring out our tech process once again. Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Manisha Gelman. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our keynote speaker today for our 12 o'clock panel. I am so thrilled to get to introduce her. Reiko Hillyer is Associate Professor of History and Chair of the History Department at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. She holds a BA in Political Science from Yale University and a PhD in History from Columbia University, with research and teaching specialties in the history of the American South, public memory, the built environment, and mass incarceration. Hillyer is the author of Designing Dixie, Tourism, Memory, and Urban Space in the New South, as well as the book that we're going to talk about. She's published scholarly work on the civil rights movement and public memory, community policing in New York City, and prison litigation in Virginia. Her recent book, A Wall is Just a Wall, The Permeability of the Prison in the 20th Century United States, has been featured on CNN and NPR and is a finalist for the 2025 Oregon Book Award. An award-winning teacher, Hillyer is also an instructor in the Inside Out Prison Exchange Program, which brings Lewis and Clark students inside a local prison to study the history of mass incarceration in an integrated class alongside incarcerated students. In 2019, she won a Public Humanities Seed Grant from the Whiting Foundation to produce a piece of devised theater at the Columbia River Correctional Institution as the culmination of her class. In 2021, she won an award from the Oregon Community Foundation to produce the devised theater piece generated by incarcerated and non-incarcerated students at a public theater with professional actors. The resulting piece, I Think of You, it was titled I Think of You, premiered in 2023 at Portland Center Stage, and a short documentary about the class directed by Eden Wormfield is premiering in the Aspen Short Fest in April 2025. I am so delighted to introduce Reiko Hillyer and hand over the mic to you, so please join me in thanking her for coming. I will just say, we are going to switch people at 1:20, so don't get up. When Reiko's session finishes, we're going to have our next speaker from 1:20 to 1:40. So those of you here for class, we're not done until our second speaker's done, just so you know, okay? All right, there we go.
Hello, thank you so much for being here. It's really incredible to be in community with people who are engaged in this topic from so many different walks of life and coming at it from so many angles. Thank you to Manisha and thank you to Betsy for bringing me here. The connections are extraordinary and we're continuing to build on them. I had the good privilege of speaking to the Lifers group yesterday at Norfolk Prison. And I really felt inspired and reaffirmed by Manisha's words about breaking down hierarchies of knowledge, who gets to know and what deserves to be known, because I was not the only historian in that room. The people I was speaking with were our subjects of history, our makers of history, our documenters of history. And in fact, there were some of the people in the room are in my book, and I got to meet them for the first time. They're still there after 40 years. I would like to say a few words about what I'm speaking about today. I'm going to show some images. I'm going to look down every once in a while with sort of awkward gestures because I'm not used to using glasses and because of my recent time in Massachusetts prison where I was not allowed to bring any paper, I have learned to speak off the cuff, but I still have to have my little notebook, so forgive my awkwardness. One of the main figures in my book is a gentleman named Arnie King, and he passed away a few weeks ago. I will speak about him and read about him as part of my presentation today, but I'd like to dedicate this talk and my participation today to him. My book, A Wall is Just a Wall, The Permeability of the Prison in 20th Century United States, is tracking what I call the thickening of prison walls, which is to say that prisons in previous decades in this country and relatively recently were much more porous than they are now. Even the harshest prisons in the country, especially in the Jim Crow South, had robust traditions of clemency, conjugal visits, and furlough. And it's this permeability that I try to trace, its rise and fall, in order to try to understand how it is that we've engaged in what I'm calling permanent exile. We incarcerate people for way too long and way too many. And what I'm trying to uncover as an historian is how this came to be, because I don't take our current system as static or natural or inevitable. I ask questions about how this all happened. And so I'm looking specifically at the practices of clemency, which is to say the power of the executive, in my story, the governors, to commute sentences or pardon people after they've served a particular amount of time, and there were lots of reasons for that, which I will discuss, but it was a robust and regular and uncontroversial practice for most of the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries, and it's since shriveled. So I look at its peak and its decline. The second part of the book is about the rise and fall of conjugal visits or family visits. These were practices by which people who were on the outside could visit their loved ones, sometimes for 36 or 48 hours in relative privacy in a cabin or in a trailer with their families to spend time together. And this is a practice that began in the Jim Crow South under rather exploitative and nefarious motivations, but eventually spread throughout the country, with California being the first state to adopt them in the 1960s. But those practices began to shrivel by the 1990s. The third part of the book looks at the rise and fall of furlough, the practice by which incarcerated people could leave prison for several hours, several days, even weeks at a time, with a promise to return, again, for various purposes, whether it was to be exploited for labor under a Jim Crow apartheid regime, or whether to work in the governor's mansion, or whether to seek employment elsewhere or speak at church groups or play at a high school prom. These practices were very liberal in Massachusetts, so Massachusetts is a case study in my book, and again, along with the first two I mentioned, begin to decline in the 1990s. So this is the general overview of the book, which I will unpack, but first I'd like to just say a few more words about prison education and the questions and experiences that led me to this book. I'm an instructor in the Inside Out Prison Exchange program. And this is a program that was started at Temple University over 20 years ago by a criminology professor named Lori Pompa, who developed a pedagogy, that is to say a method of teaching around which the class is organized, which is outside students, free students, undergraduate students, would come inside the prison and learn alongside and with incarcerated students. And so that is how my class is organized. Every week, 15 Lewis and Clark students go into the prison to meet with 15 incarcerated students whom we're learning from as peers and equals. And we always begin in a circle, sitting alternately inside, outside, myself in the circle as a facilitator of the space, not the center. And this is a situation that allows the braiding of different forms of knowledge. To go back to what Manisha said, the wisdom of lived experience integrated with the power of scholarly academic knowledge to put that lived experience in a broader social context. The students who are incarcerated have a tremendous sense of empowerment by being allowed to think and speak and express themselves and be a student rather than stuck in some confining identity of a rigid space of the prison, and are also able to place their lives in a broader historical trajectory. Even if they hold themselves accountable, they do come to understand the ways in which structures were stacked against them. The outside students who were really adept at theoretical analysis and abstract thinking and experienced with lots of academic scholarly reading can benefit tremendously from hearing from the lived experience of the incarcerated students who often are reconfirming or contradicting the texts that we read. And so together through that encounter, we're really creating different forms of knowledge, something that is greater than the sum of its parts, where all of us are transformed, and where every single voice is valued. And this experience has been so transformative for me, and not only as a human being and as an educator, but as a historian, I began to ask, well, why is this so rare? Why is such an encounter between inside and outside so precious? Of course it should be precious, but I mean precious in the sense that it is an exception to the rule of the general relationship between incarcerated people and the free world. And as I began to ask those kinds of questions, again, not taking my current world for granted as natural or fixed, I found out that, in fact, my class, Lori Pompa's class, was part of a longer history of much more permeability, exchange, and fluidity between inside and outside. And I began to do some research that was trying to historicize, that is to say, to understand the longer tradition of more exchange between inside and outside. So just to come back to the research aspect of it and how I was drawn to this topic, I was researching a prison strike in Virginia in 1968. I mean, I wasn't doing the research in 1968, but I was doing the research about the strike that took place in 1968, which was in the middle of the maelstrom of prison litigation, at which one of our guests, Calvin Harry, was at the center many, many years ago, and is going to be on one of the panels later today. And so it's really extraordinary to make this connection after all these years, because it was that research that led me to this book and now led me to you, which is that in the middle of the mayhem of 1968 in Virginia, okay? There's a conservative backlash gaining steam against the gains of the civil rights movement. There are political assassinations of Reverend King and RFK. There's a war in Vietnam. There's a tremendous anxiety about moral decay and social division and the crumbling of hierarchies. And amidst this, there's the cries for law and order. We know this story. That same moment, the governor was signing executive orders allowing incarcerated people to leave for the afternoon to play chess at a local high school for a chess tournament. And a professional boxer was allowed to leave the Virginia prison to go participate in a professional boxing match. And this was completely counterintuitive to me. And of course, I had to know more. Around that same time, the same year that I began my Inside Out Prison Exchange class at Lewis and Clark, 2012, a Republican governor, conservative governor named Haley Barbour of Mississippi, some of you may remember, who had a Confederate flag in his office, pardoned over 200 people, or commuted the sentences of over 200 people upon leaving office, including the governor's trustees who were working in his mansion. And he got so much flack from both the left and the right for being corrupt, for being being arbitrary, taking his personal preferences into account, for sort of letting criminals on the loose. And he defended his decision, saying, well, I am just following Mississippi tradition. The people deserve a second chance. And I thought this was a very strange defense. And again, I mean, this was a softball, but as a historian, I was like, what is this Mississippi tradition? I must know more. How is it that in this cradle of the Confederacy, that there could be a longer history of more permeable prisons, greater chance of release from prison permanently, and greater chance for release temporarily, and greater chance for more interaction between inside and outside? And so what I proceeded to look at were these three practices, as I mentioned, because it helps us understand mass incarceration, I hope, in several new ways. One, going back to Manisha's questions about public safety, looking at these practices, the varying reasons why people endorse them or oppose them, help us understand that the notion of public safety is something that is malleable and political and weaponized. And that we have to rethink not only what we mean by public safety, but how we can achieve public safety. This also dovetails with changing understandings of risk. Whom do we deem as being a risk? At risk? A risk to us? Are they themselves at risk? Are there algorithmic ways we can predict risk? We've become sort of obsessed with thinking about an entitlement to zero risk when it comes to the carceral system, which is not a standard that we expect in any other realm of life. And yet, what has happened is that any kind of risk of violence or harm is used as a blanket justification for extreme measures. But that has not always been the case. It turns out that in the heyday of furlough, corrections professionals believed that it was a greater risk to public safety to keep people locked up than it was to let them out. Okay? And so these ideas are contested and malleable, and by looking at some of these practices, we can begin to rethink the very purpose of prison and all of these kinds of keywords and buzzwords that we use to organize our principles and sort of unpack them and reimagine them. Another reason why I think it's useful to look at these three practices and how they decline, because it also helps us understand the politics of strange bedfellows, that sometimes it was conservative people who endorsed conjugal visits because they wanted husbands to remain devoted to the patriarchal family unit, right? Sometimes it was prison wardens who were very upset at the decline of clemency and parole because they knew that the people that they looked after or exploited, however you want to put it, were no longer a danger to society, and that the prison was a powder keg if people didn't have any hope, right? That we can't make monolithic arguments about left and right or political, conservative, liberal, Republican, Democrat, because some of the most progressive people in my story turn out to be Republicans, for example, which shows us also that there were different windows of political possibility at different times, which reminds us, again, that change is possible. I also look at the migration of different kinds of prison practices across time and space. So how do we get conjugal visits in Mississippi that then get readapted for different reasons in California? Sort of looking at how best practices circulate and change over time and space. But most of all, what I hope that this story does is illuminate the voices of those who lived through these changes. Calvin, others, people whom I met yesterday at Norfolk, lived through the changes I'm describing, which isn't to say they just witnessed it. They experienced the degeneration of their conditions. People who were able to change their children's diapers and cook a meal with their partner were now only allowed to see them through plexiglass. This is a devastating loss. So from the point of view of captivity, I'm looking at decline, right? Progress does not happen in a straight line. And we need to kind of understand how the lived experience can inform us of the devastating consequences of these kinds of policy changes. Our research can't stop at the prison gates. We need to also think about how folks who in their life cycle experience policy changes in an embodied way, and have that inform what we do. So I'm just going to go into a little more detail into the argument. Then I'm going to return to talking about my Inside Out class. I'm going to do a little of this and then take some questions. Did I leave my book down there? This is, the slide I'm showing here is the cover of the Angolite, which was the prison magazine from Angola, which is the Louisiana State Penitentiary. So now I'm reading from the book. Prison walls have not always been impermeable, and permeability has been both a vehicle for social control and a way for prisoners to resist it. During 1 month in 1968, dozens of men incarcerated at Louisiana State Penitentiary, the notorious prison known as Angola after the former plantation grounds it occupies, were allowed to leave temporarily for various purposes. Under supervision and rigorously screened, members of Angola's Bridge Club traveled to play in bridge tournaments. Imprisoned participants in Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous spoke at schools, churches, and business associations throughout the state. A country and western band composed of 6 incarcerated men, the Westernaires, played as many as 3 concerts a week at nursing homes, hospitals, and high schools. That same year, a beloved television cowboy known as Buckskin Bill, who earned fame for his children's show, Storyland, invited the Westernaires to star in their own weekly television show, Good Morning, Angola Style. Angola's JCs, a chapter of the National Leadership Training and Civic Organization, traveled nearly 200 miles to Monroe, Louisiana, to end a 2-day JC convention, where their branch won a standing ovation at an opening banquet. Some of these men, like many of those at Angola, had been convicted of murder, kidnapping, or armed robbery. Traveling outside the walls of the Louisiana State Penitentiary was part of a broader logic that assumed and accepted that almost everyone imprisoned in Angola would eventually get out. Until the late 1970s, even those with life sentences were routinely released after 10 years and 6 months via a commutation from the governor, as long as they kept a good prison record. Thus, prisoners' withdrawal from free society was understood to be temporary, and their visits outside nourished the connective tissue that would help secure their eventual reintegration into the body politic. By interacting with the public, incarcerated people could develop a sense of dignity beyond the reductive labels imposed by the criminal justice system, and by contributing to society through music, lectures, or charity work, they could counter the public's preconceived ideas about convicts. The traveling ambassadors refused stigma and social disfranchisement by claiming a positive identity beyond the site of the prison and by developing a track record of accomplishments that would earn them early release. I'm still reading from the introduction. This will be the last section I'm reading, but it's just to give you a sense of the downfall of these practices. In 1970, just 143 people were serving life without parole sentences in Louisiana. By 2021, the lifer population had grown to 4,400. While the increasing separation of the prison from free society has redrawn the prison boundary, incarcerated people are also restrained by a tightened temporal boundary that fastens them in their past. Nonetheless, prisoners change just as the prison has changed around them. They continue to grow, hope, work, and serve one another, demonstrating they are not the same people that they were when they committed their original crimes. Darren James, who has served 30 years since being incarcerated at age 19, has been involved in the Islamic community and Alcoholics Anonymous, but is most proud of the work he has done in prison hospice, a feature of the prison that has developed in response to its aging population. As James notes, quote, "We human beings, we make mistakes, you know. I'm not my worstest mistake. I am not that person," unquote. Darrell Waters also presses beyond the confines of his original conviction. Quote, "All we regard is a thug on the street 24, 25 years ago, so we're angry at that person, not realizing that that person doesn't exist for at least 20 years," unquote. These men refuse to be turned to stone. They also know that the laws that keep them locked up are not written in stone. In 1968, at the height of Jim Crow, people had a greater chance of leaving a brutal Louisiana prison, either temporarily or by early release, than they would 50 years later. For those incarcerated during those 50 years, the ground had shifted dramatically. We now understand that mass incarceration is relatively new. What is even newer is mass disappearance. So by mass disappearance, I'm referring to the trend of longer sentences with less chance of release and less contact with the outside world. So I'm just going to give a few points from each of the sections of my book to get a little empirical on you, and hope that this will be a teaser for the book. This is a governor's executive order for clemency. In Louisiana, as I mentioned in the introduction, there was a customary practice of rubber stamping a warden's recommendation for release after 10 years and 6 months of a life sentence. People pled guilty with the understanding that their sentence would automatically be reviewed at 10 years and 6 months. This was routine, it was unquestioned, and this in the Jim Crow South. Now, I don't want to romanticize Southern prisons in the 19th and 20th centuries by any stretch of the imagination, but it is sort of to destabilize our understandings of where we locate punitiveness and the possibilities for mercy. Because as it turns out, mercy was kind of the velvet glove of racism. It was a way to shore up the sovereign power of the executive. It was an alibi for labor extraction, to release prisoners, to be under the employ of white guardians, essentially. And as long as the architecture of Jim Crow remained strong on the wall, outside the prison walls, corrections folks and governors could afford to be more merciful, even with selfish motives. But it's still to say that there was a sense of obligation among executives to release people after a certain period of time. There was many occasions when governors in Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana would assemble what they called the Forgotten Men's Committee. And they would go to the prison and roam around and try to find people that didn't have anyone to vouch for them, that didn't have the wherewithal to apply for clemency, and essentially would see people beg and might grant mercy, right? And so this should trouble us, right, because of the ways in which it drips of this kind of paternalistic white supremacy. But there was this idea that people don't have to be confined perpetually, and for the folks who were inside, it made a big difference whether they were inside or outside. And so this governor's petition, this governor's executive order is just one of those examples of archival documents, just to give you a sense of a person who is about to be commuted after 10 years and 6 months. So clemency was routine. It was the reward for docile behavior and subservience in the Jim Crow South. And in that sense, it should be regarded as problematic. And in that context, it makes sense then that the civil rights movement would disrupt that, right? As folks begin to act out of their proper place, quote unquote, and begin to gain democratic rights, there's a kind of vengeful, what would you call a revanchism, right? A return to kind of circling the wagons and trying to find other ways of containing potentially dangerous people. And so we have the roots of mass incarceration, right, that equates civil rights activism with crime. But all the way through the 1980s, Southern governors continued to commute the sentences of their mansion trustees, who were almost always black and who were always convicted of murder. They were not considered to be the most dangerous. They were considered to be the folks who had the most to lose if they misbehaved because of the promise of release. It was understood, this was common wisdom, so to speak, that those folks must have acted out of a crime of passion. They're not habitual criminals. If they know how to behave, I will let them go. And this was understood as almost a contractual arrangement. Right? And so this also gives us a sense of the extent or the terms or conditions of mercy. But all the way through the 1980s, Southern governors were engaging in clemency in ways that they wouldn't later. Edwin Edwards, the Democratic governor of Louisiana, in his 2 terms, commuted the sentences of over 1,000 people. And this after one person to whom he granted clemency to shot and killed his brother. He still said, I believe in second chances, I did the right thing, okay? So that's one way to go about it. Choices. In Mississippi, Governor William Winter was also interested in clemency for more practical reasons. He continued to use clemency powers to relieve overcrowding in the 1980s. It was not obvious yet in the 1980s, with all this talk of fiscal austerity, that increasing mass incarceration and building more prisons was not even necessarily on the table. It was corrections officials who said, we have to look at incarceration as a very, very limited resource, and we should look for other ways to deal with social transgression. This is correctional professionals saying this. And the Southern governor, William Winter, held a conference on decarceration in Mississippi in 1984 and proceeded to commute the sentences of hundreds of people to alleviate prison overcrowding. So we need to look at these stories in order to see disruptions in the traditional narrative and to sort of examine the mechanisms that we can have at our disposal to help with back-end relief. In Massachusetts, clemency was very robust. It was not just a practice born out of Southern paternalism. In Massachusetts, in between the 70s and 80s, with Republican Frank Sargent and Democrat Michael Dukakis, 470 people had their sentences commuted. Just decades later, Duval Patrick, 0. Okay, a black Democrat. So it has become a political third rail. And this is a mechanism that exists in the hands of executives, and this is something whose history I think can be useful at this moment to remind them that that is not a radical idea. The second part of my book is on the history of conjugal visits or family visits. And these began at Parchman Farm in Mississippi. Mississippi State Penitentiary was essentially, Parchman Farm is a plantation prison, which is more or less a gulag of the state. It was founded to extract labor from formerly enslaved people and a site to contain criminalized people as a response to the rights gained from emancipation and Reconstruction. So it was a modern invention designed to coerce labor out of folks, right, and disfranchise them. So there was no pretense to rehabilitation. Conjugal visits were not meant to improve moral virtue. They were instead meant as a carrot for workers whose morale otherwise might get a little low. And so the logic was, if you throw them this privilege, and they get what they need for their bodies on the weekend, they'll work hard on Monday. So this is a practice that began for, racist and nefarious and self-serving purposes. But lo and behold, by the 1960s, there's this new philosophy called community corrections that talks about let's normalize behavior in prison so that it resembles more life on the outside. Because we understand now, because of all of this prison unrest and prison violence and reports of rape, that we need a kind of safety valve, we need a new set of privileges, we need new incentives to have people behave. And it was none other than Governor Ronald Reagan of California who listened to some researchers who said, hey, look, Mississippi has this experiment in conjugal visits. Maybe we should take a trip down there and see what's what. And Ronald Reagan confessed that because of his conservative bona fides, that he could afford to engage in a practice that seemed to be common sense. He also happened to be, an incredibly conservative homophobe who was concerned about what was called then situational homosexuality, right? Conjugal visits, family visits may seem progressive to us, and in a certain kind of sense, but he is also using them as a way of shoring up heterosexual family values and patriarchy, in the face of moral decay. So this practice then becomes not best practices. Only about 15 to 17 states ever enacted them. But Mississippi also began to formalize its practice. And this is something people could make jokes about and think about as being somewhat sordid. But it is not sordid to the father who gets to change his child's diaper or help them with homework or have a picnic on a blanket or wash dishes after a meal. These kinds of practices were essential to the emotional survival of folks who were incarcerated and also to maintain family ties in the longer term. In Norfolk, there was someone in the audience who's an elder who referred to having spent time with his son, on picnics and playing horseshoe and doing homework together, and that his son is now an adult who's highly functioning and doing really well because they were able to have that relationship instead of it being through glass. So this image is from the Associated Press. It is a cabin or house that is in Mississippi State Penitentiary. This is from 1959, just as a visual to demonstrate that. I'm now going to talk about furlough. Let me just actually pause on that image. Furlough is one of those practices that really gets at the question of how we define risk and how we define redeemability, and whether or not we are willing to allow people to change, or if we're always going to freeze them at their worst moment, to quote Manisha from earlier. So I'm going to read again from a passage that I quite enjoy. I enjoyed writing it, and so I want to share. Peter Makarowitz enjoyed planting tomatoes in the garden. After patting down the soil, he mowed the backyard lawn and sat down to breakfast with his mother and sister. He was not used to talking to women, but these ladies were family. And it was a thrill to drink coffee out of a heavy mug emblazoned with "World's Greatest Uncle" and eat his eggs with real silverware. Once it was time to leave, Makarowitz had to steady himself as he maneuvered through the living room furniture. To him, it looked like a hoarder's dollhouse. There was so much stuff, but it all seemed so tiny. He was used to wide spaces, long corridors, and empty rooms. Makarowitz walked to the corner store, screwed up his nerve, and asked to buy a pack of cigarettes, flinching when the bell on the door jangled as he exited the store. When he returned to his mother's house, she was waiting with her car running to take him back to the Massachusetts Correctional Institution, where he continued to serve a life sentence for murder. Massachusetts was one of the most liberal states in granting furloughs, but again, like other practices I mentioned, they began in Mississippi and in the South. Christmas furloughs, as they were known, were privileges, but also sort of an assumed routine part of being incarcerated in plantation prisons. People would be released for Christmas holidays for 10 days at a time. And when a couple failed to return, there was no outcry or sensationalism because it was understood there were other ways of getting that person back in line. but having a chance to be out in the free world, even under the exploitation of someone else, might give someone the opportunity to connect with their family, visit an ailing relative, to take care of their affairs, and otherwise connect with the world changing around them. By the time the 1960s roll around, again with this philosophy of community corrections, there's this idea that more fluidity between inside and outside is going to produce greater public safety. With all of the prison unrest and outright revolt, we think of Attica in 1971, there was a belief from all sides of the political spectrum, including politicians, that whatever is going on in prison is not sustainable. And so there was a willingness to experiment, and everything was on the table. And furlough, which began in Mississippi in the South as a racist practice, again, was something that was adopted by all 50 states. And in Massachusetts, it was particularly robust, not only because of an enlightened Republican governor named Francis Sargent, but also a very proactive and brave DOC commissioner named Charles Boone. And this was a time of great prison unrest, the Walpole story, I'm sure some of you know about. We can't really discuss it here. But one of the demands that folks inside were making was for furlough. Now, there were other folks who said furlough is a bribe. Furlough is a way to quiet us down. Furlough is a way to divide us. I'm not having it. Right? But then there were others, like Arnie King, who said, what? Bribe? Sign me up. Where the paperwork at? Because I want to see my family and they deserve to see me without chains on. Right? The thing about conjugal visits and family visits is that it brings free people into the carceral space. And however pleasant that may be, it may be quite damaging. And for corrections officials, they preferred furlough. They thought it was safer. They thought it was better for reintegration. They thought it was less work for them, right? They thought it would cost less. We don't have to build another building. So there's so much contingency here at this moment of roads not taken and different kinds of constituencies of people willing to think experimentally in ways that are hard for us to imagine now or even see because we lump all of corrections together. Right? But there's division among people in corrections, and there's division between corrections and people in politics, right? And so we need to know whom we're talking to and what their motives are. I'm just going to read a little bit about Arnold King. Oh, the one other thing I'll mention is that one of the reasons why Massachusetts had such liberal furlough policies was not just because of the activism of incarcerated people and the sort of a prevalence of a new idea of best practices in the professional discourse, but also because of a lawsuit by someone who was someone serving life, who, with changing eligibility guidelines, found himself left out when furlough eligibility was reformed to exclude lifers. And there was this argument that, well, you know, they're lifers. Why do they need furlough? And they've been convicted of murder. So Arthur Devlin sued, and he was a lifer, and he sued for furlough. And the judge supported his argument, Devlin's argument, and allowed for furlough for lifers, and said that nobody actually serves life in prison anyway in Massachusetts because clemency is so regular. So given that everyone, even people serving life, will get out, well then of course we need to allow furlough as part of a preparation for release. Even William Horton, the fellow who became the poster child for Republicans who wanted to argue that Dukakis was soft on crime because of Horton's alleged, convicted of crime while he was out on furlough. Willie Horton also said in an interview, of course people should have furloughs before they get commutation. It would not be wise to commute the sentence of someone who has not had a chance to be out in the past 40 years. Right? So these practices go hand in hand. And the William Horton case, which many of you are aware of or lived through, is a case in which William Horton, who was serving life for murder, and had earned enough privileges through his behavior in prison to work at a mental institution, along with other incarcerated people who went on a DOC bus under DOC surveillance, but nonetheless were working in a public institution, feeding and cleaning and spending time with people who had severe mental disabilities. But he wanted to go home. And he finally was able to get furlough and had 10 or 12 furloughs before he eventually absconded and committed this new crime. And this was in 1988. And this was, of course, the thing that made great hay of this exceptional situation of someone committing a new crime while on furlough. When in fact furlough was 99.8% successful, which is to say that almost everyone returned, and to the extent that it deviated from 100% success, the 0.1% of people who fail eventually returned, right? The metrics are calculating who arrives on time. If you're 2 hours late, okay, it counts as a failure of a furlough. Right, so this was an empirically successful program, and there's a shift here happening where the exception is portrayed as the rule, where this one exceptional case is presented as typical rather than exceptional, and turns into a kind of a boogeyman for fomenting fear and gaining political capital in order to legitimate the state as protector from the harrowing crime you will no doubt face if people like William Horton are let out. This became such common knowledge that the kind of ephemera of the time period suggests the new common sense that's being created. This is a Monopoly card that was created by the students for Republican something or other. I can't. Right, the College Republican National Committee, and this is a get-out-of-jail-free card. You can get these on eBay. Michael Dukakis's furlough plan allowed convicted murderers to take a weekend leave from prison. One, Willie Horton, left and never came back, instead viciously raped and beat a woman while her fiancé was forced to helplessly listen to her screams. This is only one example of many. Okay, that's where he gets it wrong, right? I mean, it may, if someone was victimized, that is a fact, right? This is one example of many, not a fact. In the last several years, Michael Dukakis has furloughed more than one murderer per day. Yes, they have been convicted of murder. Does that mean that every time they leave, they're on a rampage, right? It's a completely distorted view of the people who are actually most quote-unquote dangerous, if you want to use that language, whether you're using the language of recidivism, which is also problematic. The folks who have been convicted of first-degree murder and are serving life are the least likely to commit new crimes upon release. So unlikely that there was a point when Governor Reagan in the 60s suggested that murder be turned into a nonviolent offense for the purposes of revisiting a sentence because the likelihood of that person committing new crimes was so small. So again, the ideas we have of risk are different. They're political and politicized. I'm now going to read about Arnold King, who was caught in the crosshairs of this political shift. Arnie King is here pictured at about 19. I believe he was born in 1952. And then I'll end shortly after that for those of you who are itching. So what's happened, okay, this will be my little transition. See what happens when you don't have a written talk? So in Arizona in 1988, the eligibility for furlough changed, where previously eligibility for furlough was based on your conduct in prison and your disciplinary record in prison. In 1988, eligibility changed to what was the nature of the original offense. Right, so you were tethered to your original offense forever. Clemency guidelines, Dukakis's clemency guidelines, Francis Sargent's clemency guidelines, at the foremost of the principles according to which they deem they will use the clemency power is the transformation and remorse and rehabilitation of the individual. That is first and foremost, and it's written in the principles that they declare upon becoming governor. Later governors, King, Patrick, nature of the original offense is at the top and rehabilitation is not there. What is there is responsibility for the crime. What that means is if you contest anything about the process, you are not showing responsibility. So clemency, furlough, conjugal visits, these all decline at the same time. And I'm going to just use my last few minutes to read about Arnie King and then read the conclusion to the book and then show you a couple more images from my class. Is that okay? Are you hanging with me? Okay, because I know that this is, I'm speaking really fast. I'm spending more time on each section than I had anticipated, but I'm feeling the energy from you all. Seriously. So it's your fault. The permanent stigma of the original crime now taints even the most extraordinary of clemency petitions. The case of Arnold King is a devastating example. In 1971, King shot and killed John Labanara, a law student and aide to Boston Mayor Kevin White, during an attempt to buy drugs. King described himself as, quote, an 18-year-old high school dropout who consumed drugs and alcohol every day and shot Labanara in a drunken haze. Nearly every article discussing the killing mentions that Labanara was shot just as he was celebrating passing the bar exam. King was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to LWOP. Unfortunately, he brought his first clemency petition in 1987, just as Willie Horton's arrest in Maryland chilled the Dukakis administration's approach to discretionary release. When King's attorney, Edward Birkin, testified before the board at a 2007 clemency hearing, he detailed King's unsupervised monthly furloughs as evidence that he would be a law-abiding citizen if he were released. In addition to visiting with his wife, whom he married, by the way, on a furlough, on a 48-hour furlough at Jamaica Pond, and stayed at the Westin. Can you imagine a person convicted of murder? And we know what an incredible human he was, those of us who knew him. Detailed King's unsupervised monthly furloughs as evidence he would be a law-abiding citizen. In addition to visiting with his wife, relatives, and friends, King spoke at churches and youth facilities, quote, to counsel young people to be positive in their families, positive in their communities, in essence telling them, don't do what I did. After furloughs were banned, King consulted with youth agencies and parents on criminal justice issues, connected children with prisoners to present, quote, the reality and consequences of becoming involved in criminal behavior. He wrote articles and book reviews and earned bachelor's and master's degrees. Quote, I am here today not as an 18-year-old who in a moment of rage and stupor prevented John Labanara from living in our society and pursuing his goals and objectives, King told the board. Quote, rather, I am here today, this morning, 55 years old at the end of this year, to show that I have transformed my life and can be of greater service to the community. I'm living my life in remembrance of who I was. This is important. I'm living my life in remembrance of who I was, but I don't want to be stuck there. Okay? Throughout the decades that spanned his 9 clemency hearings, he received the support of the Black Legislative Caucus, attorneys, clergy, artists, Professor Charles Ogletree, etc., but he did not get clemency. None of the governors would hear his petition after Dukakis, and he was eventually released, thankfully, after serving 50 years in prison, and he was released because a judge noted that all the potential black jurors were struck from the jury that convicted him. So that's excellent. However, that does not recognize his growth over time. right, which clemency would have. Mr. King passed away a couple of weeks ago, about 4 or 5 years after he was released. I want to just read, oh no, where is it? Sorry. I can't find it. I'm going to move on to my conclusion, which is to come back to my Inside Out Prison Exchange class. Here we are in 2019, the Lewis and Clark students about to enter Columbia River Correctional Institution, which is a minimum security prison in North Portland, and it's a release facility, so that means that people are there serving sentences of 5 years or less, or they are at the tail end of very long sentences. So we have lots of different ages, lots of different levels of experience with prison in our class. As Manisha mentioned, I got this grant to support the creation of a devised theater piece, which is to say a theater piece that is created by the students rather than from a pre-written script. And the piece, which was entitled I Think of You, was a series of vignettes and monologues and historical reflections to share with a broader audience what the students learned about mass incarceration and what they learned about each other. The grant then allowed me to adapt this piece for performance by professional actors in a professional stage. It was that class that was filmed for this documentary called Classroom 4. Transforming that experience of the class of 30 people, creating composite characters, so we only used 6 actors, using our bodies to try to create ways to convey the prison space, the contrast between the life of students and the life of inside students versus the life of outside students, but also to really capture the love and connection we began to feel for each other. This is a scene of kind of the play within the play within the play at Portland Center Stage. And this was a part of a movement sequence that's demonstrating the extent to which we want to hug each other, but of course we are not allowed to touch. In the lobby of the theater, we created this postcard wall. The title is called I Think of You, of the play, and that is based on a piece within the play where a student who is free talks about how she thinks about the inside students at every minute of the day, that if she's stuck in traffic and she's frustrated, she says, well, you know, I know that Joey would give anything, even his tattoo gun, to have the privilege of sitting in traffic, you know, and going to pick her friend up at the airport. Oh, you know, how lucky I am that I get to be with my family. There's some people who can't be with their family. So this sort of sense that the class had really penetrated her very being became the title of the play. And so we created this postcard wall. Each of those orange postcards says, I think of you. And people in the audience were invited then to turn the postcard around and write a message to the incarcerated authors of the play. By the end of the first evening, these cards were turned upside down, inside out. This is one of them from an audience member. I think of you when I lay me down to sleep, and I do not dream of freedom, but I should. I should dream of it for you. I think of you when I get angry with a family member, then remember that I have a family, however flawed. I think of you when the crows yell at me, they know your story, they shout at me to remember you. This was another one I really loved. So at the end of the class, the students are asked to write goodbyes to each other. And one of those goodbyes became the concluding words of the play. This is very meta because we use the footage of the actual class as the backdrop for this concluding scene, where an actor who's portraying Ben Hall, my former student, is speaking these words. So we're trying to magnify, right, from inside to outside, further out. Sorry. Our time together has not truly come to an end. This world we've created is in no way transitory. We carry it beyond the threshold of these doors. Inside, we go on to mentor others as we carry your faces and words in our hearts, remembering that you treated us as human beings. You go on to continue building the world around you and how you interact, love, vote, and speak to power. We will always have the context we shared together. No one can take that from us, and no one can stop us from recreating what is possible to create with others. And this is where I really want to echo Manisha's comment about, sort of not only breaking down barriers between knowledge, but breaking down the barriers between us and how that can be an act of abolition by beginning to transform away from the myths that we've all been trained with, and once we start to question those myths, we start to question why the walls are there in the first place, right? When you feel comfortable with the person in front of you and you're more anxious because of the rules of the prison than because you're speaking to someone who killed someone, something's wrong. All right, so this is Ben Hall, R.I.P. It is a strange thing to come into a prison to learn together and build a community where it is so discouraged to do so. In many ways, we create our own world as we steal time in a place where many might imagine such a magical experience could never transpire. While we are longing to exit this space, you all desire to beat the door down and get back inside. Our intentionality creates a world that did not exist before, which demonstrates that it is possible to do so, to build the world as it could be together. It is this deliberate and creative practice in the world that will chip away at the foundation of the prison. We must build something that is similar to what we've done with each other in this class. So I'm going to conclude there, and I think we have about 14 minutes for questions or comments. I would love to hear how any of this lands with you. I don't even know what I said. Any questions or comments? Oh. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Yes. Well, I began by trying to find opportunities in Portland to engage with people who were incarcerated. And that came to me about 25 years ago when my dearest friend was working for the Innocence Project. And I was beginning to see, as many people were, how the innocent are really the canary in the coal mine, that they are revealing all of the flaws in the system that allowed an innocent person to be convicted. But then I began to see those issues, but this was all sort of in my personal realm. It was not in my realm as an educator or as a teacher or as a grad student. It was just sort of my personal thing. So I was like, oh, okay, I love yoga, and I would like to teach yoga in the prison. And I took a training to teach yoga inside a sort of trauma-informed program that certified people to train, to teach yoga to sort of at-risk populations or underserved populations. And I had the dilemma, too, that I'm sure Manisha can speak to, of like reform versus abolition. Like, oh, wait a minute, am I just creating more docile incarcerated people? Am I, sort of making prison pretty and creating something that the administration can point to as a feather in their cap? Once I got in there and was face to face with actual living humans who just need to feel accepted and need a space to breathe, where nothing is expected of them except to be and take care of themselves, and how important that was to them, I started feeling like, okay, I'm not a policymaker. Maybe what I can do is to engage in a direct human way, because that's something that I feel comfortable with. Not everybody does. So I began to teach the yoga more regularly, and then a dear activist scholar named Nicole Siegel, who's at Indiana, who's also a yogi, she said, well, you need to learn about the Inside Out Prison Exchange program. And when I began to take this training for the Inside Out Prison Exchange program, I realized that my personal and political interests needed to be more entwined with my pedagogical, educational, professional work, and that I would be rewarded by being more integrated myself, and bring a sort of holistic sense of justice and importance to more of my teaching. So I took the training, which was the most extraordinary professional development thing I've ever done. It was done structured as an inside-out class. So there were 15 trainees who were professors in various disciplines from around the country and around the world, and 15 coaches who were serving life sentences at Graterford Prison. And we met inside there, not every day, because we couldn't, but a lot of our work was done with them, as giving us feedback on lesson plans we had, testing out the pedagogy with them, and so forth. And so I was a visiting instructor, and I just decided to pilot this at Lewis and Clark. I didn't have a permanent job. I wasn't even on the tenure track. I was like, but if it's the last thing I do, it'll be the best thing I do. And I managed to get it through the curriculum committee, but the inside students didn't get credit. So the next thing, it's this thing where you start the thing, you have your proof of concept, and then you get it. And so then we got the credit bearing. Then we got, after many years, a grant to expand the program so that more teachers in different disciplines can offer the class, so that I'm not the only one. I was offering crime and punishment in the United States for 12 years, and it was fantastic. It's the best thing I've ever done, continues to be the best thing I will ever do. But there's hunger for more disciplines, more classes, serving more students. So now, thanks to a Mellon grant, we have a studio art class in portraiture, a class in Latin American testimonial literature, world literature, poetry, and performance. So it's grown, and that's the story.
I'm going to read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, which really argues that, with the success of the civil rights movement, that it was an opportunity by some politicians to continue to oppress and control Black Americans by, focusing on the war on crime and mass incarceration. I'm just wondering if that's part of your analysis, is if that was sort of the justification by a lot of elected officials to change those more forward-thinking policies that existed through the 1960s?
That's such a great historical question. First of all, I would not say that that was the way policymakers justified their position. They would not say explicitly, we would like to roll back the gains of the civil rights movement. What they begin to do, and this is what Alexander means by colorblindness, is to use, purportedly race-based neutral language of crime and criminality to then justify draconian measures to produce social order and contain a dissident class, right? Yes. And I think that she sort of undersells a little bit, because it's not her point. I mean, she's making a specific argument about the war on drugs. The complicity and agency of liberals in putting up the architecture of mass incarceration. Already by the 1960s, with the Kerner Commission report and prison unrest, there's plenty of opportunity for liberal Democrats to engage in more progressive ideas towards those who transgress social norms and laws, but instead funneled more money into professionalizing police. And this is where liberals are sort of in the mix, is this idea of professionalization and standardization, right? We're going to bureaucratize punishment and thereby make it more fair. And part of this is a really good faith effort to address the prejudices in the American South, where the discretion of judges and prosecutors was always informed by white supremacist norms, if not, sincerely held beliefs. So the idea of mandatory minimums, for example, was something that was endorsed by both the left, well, I wouldn't say the left, both liberals and the right, as a way of sort of reducing discretion. Okay, so discretion of any kind. Let's look at things on a case-by-case basis. Let's look at how the person has changed. Let's sort of forget our rigid metrics and think about, more complex way of reading human thriving and danger. No. Instead, the bureaucratization of punishment, happened to coincide with more conservative ideas about punitiveness and pandering to a fear-mongered public, and those things overlapped. And it's that sweet spot that kind of moved that Overton window of political possibility so that even Democrats, who had the burden of now proving that they're not soft on crime, but being even more draconian, Bill Clinton, Joe Biden, right? These are folks who endorsed the Anti-Terrorism and Death Penalty Act, which expanded the carceral state. And interestingly, much like Reagan, or sort of the inverse of Ronald Reagan saying, well, I'm conservative, I can do something practical, these guys are saying, well, I'm seen as liberal, I need to do something more conservative.
Hi. I can imagine that the pandemic impacted the programs that you were doing. I was just curious how you were able to stay engaged through, or how you were able to re-engage afterwards with students in the work that you were doing in the prison systems.
That's such a great question. I'm sure this could be a question across every realm of the carceral system, as well as our whole society, the extent to which those barriers produced even more isolation and more obstruction and more loneliness and more danger and harm for those on the inside who are particularly vulnerable to the virus. And that was one of those moments where, we realized, well, the walls are actually quite penetrable because there are workers and staff and employees going in and out all the time. And the virus doesn't know from politics and walls, and it's going in and out, right? So it's interesting to think all the ways that those walls are always being penetrated, even against the policies that want otherwise. Our program, I was teaching a class in spring of 2020, and the class was shut down. It was my Lewis and Clark students who were enrolled, because unlike Emerson's extraordinary program, our inside students aren't matriculated at Lewis and Clark. They're getting college credit, but it's sort of a special category of student. So I was still going to give the inside students credit, but the expectation that I still sort of interface with them on a regular basis, like that was more sort of fungible. So the first, I think it was Friday, May 20th or something like this, March, the dreaded March 2020, I met my outside students on Zoom to read a memoir of a formerly incarcerated person, and we were just all like so sad on this thing, like we don't really want to discuss this book because we can't hear the opinions of half our classmates, and we really, really wanted to know what they had to say. That's one of the things that's so remarkable about this, is like the true value and true presence of listening that happens in that space more than any other I've been in. The inside students, we continued to try to cobble something together by whatchamacallit, doing just snail mail. Like, I mean, I went and picked up papers, I dropped off papers with comments on them. There were things that were scanned and mailed to me so they could do the written work, but there was no opportunity for discussion. There was no internet access. And the nature of the class, you know, really changed. And of course, it just spoke to the very reality we were studying. Then, you know, there was a later time when it seemed as though our class could resume, and it was canceled at the, I mean 2 semesters later, like after COVID, and waiting to hear when we could get back. And that class was canceled at last minute, not because of COVID per se, but because there was a staff shortage because correctional officers were refusing to wear masks. And there was a mask mandate from the governor in public institutions, and the correctional officers refused to wear masks. And so they weren't allowed to go to work, which meant that they couldn't have additional programming. I'm sure people can speak to this in ways that are more devastating than even my story, because this was a minimum security prison in the city of Portland. But like many programs that stopped during COVID just never came back. You know, these are all volunteer programs. These are not, you know, provided as a matter of course. These are out of the goodness of people's hearts. And you know, some of them are overextended, or they, you know, the organization folds, or the person who was the contact is, you know, no longer has any historical memory of the relationship with the, you know, so there are all kinds of things that just disappeared and never came back. And last week we were shut out because of another COVID outbreak. But thankfully, my administrator on the inside, thank you, James Hanley, did set up Zoom for us in a conference room where the prisoners, they call themselves prisoners, by the way, terminology, went into a conference room that's normally reserved for staff, like employees and administrators, like with fancy chairs and stuff, and they were like, ooh, the chairs. And so we managed to see them through Zoom in a very belabored and somewhat unsatisfying way, but we did get to see them, and now we know that Zoom works in there. I think we're at our time. Thank you so much. My book is over there.